My name is Noel Bell. I'm a psychotherapist based in London, and this is a podcast with Allan Frater. Allan is the author of Waking Dreams, Imagination in Psychotherapy and Everyday Life. It's hot off the presses, so I'm delighted to be chatting to Allan now about this really excellent book on exploring imagination in psychotherapy and waking dreams. Allan, good morning.
No, good morning. Good to be
How
here.
good to have you. How are you doing north of the river?
I'm in North London. Yeah, I'm well. Yeah. We're recording just after publication day, so the book is out there in the world, meeting readers, doing what it needs to do. So that's it's exciting. I've never written a book before, so it's all a bit new.
So now author, but UKCP accredited psychotherapist and teacher at the Psychosynthesis Trust in Southeast London.
South London, London
Dooley
Bridge.
Street, London Bridge, yeah.
Yeah, I've been teaching there for 12 years or so, 10 years. And that's where I trained in psychosynthesis. And I mean, that's where the book's grown out of. I mean, in the acknowledgements, first person was the wife. I had to acknowledge the wife and the support she gave me. The second acknowledgements was the staff and student of the Psychosynthesis Trust. Because I've been teaching around this topic and pursuing some research questions, and the opportunity to share that and explore it together with staff, colleagues, but also the students, and try things out and be asked to clarify, and has been a really fertile soil, I guess, out of which the book's just written that up, really. So yeah, so that's my home, really. That's where I teach. Yeah.
So Allan, there's it's such a rich area landscape. We're going to try and succinctly keep it to a reasonable time. And really, the questions you pose in the book yourself, I mean, I'm looking at the introduction section now, page 13. What exactly is imagination? What's going on when we imagine? How can we imagine more fully, and why would we want to? So, that's kind of what the book then amplifies and answers. So I'm fired a lot of questions at you there, but maybe.
Yeah, could get into that. Well, they're big questions, and the fun thing is that not many books on imagination explore them directly. Imagination's valued and certainly employed or used within the therapy literature, but not a lot of places actually say what it is and address what goes on when we imagine. And that's always kind of bugged me. It's always seemed frustrating, because when I started a therapy training, it was in large part to try and get some advice on what I considered to be my kind of failing or impoverished imagination. I thought therapy training would be a good place to go to get that back again, that kind of story-filled sense of possibility and playfulness that was kind of fading with the passing years. There was two reasons why that didn't really happen. I mean, we were doing lots of things, lots of exercises, techniques, visualizations, making masks, psychodrama. It was all very exciting. But there's two underlying reasons, I think, why the therapy training in itself didn't really enhance my imagination. The first one, briefly, is the theory assumes an inner imagination. So we talk about an inner journey, we talk about an inner child, we talk about an inner dialogue.
Let's close your eyes and go into that inner world.
Close your eyes and go inside. That's how a lot of these techniques begin. And that's fine, because images are inside us, but they're not just inside us. And that language is a bit abstract. And when used alongside imaginative experience, it can get in the way, because if you think about a dream, which is like the pristine environment of imagination, we don't meet the inner child, we meet a child. Calling the child an inner child creates a sort of distance. It's like it's a part of you, or it's something to do with your history. These are ideas that move us away from the encounter, the participation with story and dream. The second thing was that while imagination was used, it was of secondary importance. The emphasis seemed to be on what images meant, and they were translated into what was important, which was feelings and beliefs and real world events. And the process of how we imagine seemed to be rather entirely taken for granted. It was the outcome of these techniques that created content that was used not unlike a sleeping dream. It was like something you would take along to therapy and then wonder about it for psychological insight, which is great and really useful. But for me, that's thinking about images. What I was interested in, and what the book explores, is how to live a more imaginative life. So it kind of arose out of a frustration with a blind spot, if you like, within much of therapy. I'm trying to fill in the gaps.
So just on a personal level then, with your journey, did you feel like you had evolved to a more image-centric way of working at the end of your training, or was the end of your training just the start of it?
I like that line. The end of the training is just the start of it, because that's very much, that was my experience, because you start to practice and see clients, and you have a very steep learning curve. Well, it's both, I suppose. It's been a journey. I was always told in my training, you want to learn how you want to do therapy. You want to learn what your inspirations are, what you're drawing upon, what meets your temperament and turns you into the particular therapist that you are. And so I was reading all these books about imagination. I was interested in James Hillman, Mary Watkins, Robert Bosnak, and ecopsychology latterly, Andy Fisher, Nick Totten, David Abram. So I was trying to fuse these things together, and slowly worked out what I call an image-centric approach, but it took a while to figure out what that is, which is essentially a way of working that puts images primary, and within images are feelings, thoughts, and sensations. So it's a way to work with the images that people bring, or to see what people bring through an image-centric lens. Because if you think about it, what do people bring to therapy? They bring their memories, whether that's last week or childhood. They bring their anxieties about the future, fantasies about what might happen. That's images as well. And also they bring their present moment perceptions, for example, of the therapist in the transference, how they see us, the story they tell about us is an image, is a process, an act of imagination. So it's a way to notice those images and then not just rush away from them and say, what do you think that means? But to work with the image itself. So to describe the image, to enter into the image, to participate in the story. Not in any rush, like I say, to tie it up with an interpretation, but in the faith that participation in that image/story is healing and transformative. In the same way that watching a nice movie, maybe you go to the movies, you're a bit depressed of an afternoon, you go to a matinee, and you leave the cinema a little bit less depressed than when you went in.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. Say you did. You've been moved by the language of images. You might have ideas as to why that particular movie has shifted you away from being so depressed, but you don't need to. And often if you've spent the whole movie wondering about it and how it's constructed, i.e. thinking about it, it won't have impinged upon you in the way that it would if you just allowed yourself to be drawn into the story. So contact with images in that up close and immersive sense is healing and transformative. That's what I'm trying to do in the book and in my work.
So let's just look at some of these terms. What is tame imagination, and what is mild? I was going to say mild. There's a slip.
Wild.
Wild imagination.
Wild imagination. So my website is wildimagination.uk. I don't really go into wild versus tame too much in the book. However, for me, a wild imagination is an imagination set free, running wild, not trapped. So it's an imagination encountered in its natural habitat. So it's a bit like going on safari, and you're out there walking around with the lions and the antelopes in their natural environment. As opposed, and that's what I'm trying to get to in the book, as opposed to a tame imagination, which is another way of thinking about the inner imagination. So that's like an imagination that's limited or trapped within. Because how we think about imagination and the language that we approach it with, that's a belief system. There are assumptions within that, philosophical assumptions, that whether we're conscious of them or not, especially if we're unconscious about them, will shape our experience as therapists, but also limit our clients' ability to be imaginative. And a tame imagination for me is like going to the zoo. So we peer in at the animals in cages from a distance through the bars. Because if an image is inside me or part of me, that puts me on the outside looking in, and there's a barrier there. As opposed to the wild imagination, which is to run free and not have any separation, to be immersed in an imaginative encounter. And it also speaks to my interest in eco-psychology, because there's a big inspiration from Nick Totten. He's got a great book called Wild Therapy. And he's trying to do a similar thing more broadly with therapy and relate it to eco-psychology. I loved the turning inside out of eco-psychology. They explore not just our relationship to feelings and thoughts and body sensations, but they place that within the context of the land, of our relationship to the environment. Eco meaning home, so like where we live, our sense of belonging, and the problem being our alienation from the senses and place. So I loved how that sort of turned inside out, a kind of intrapsychic or inner emphasis. But they never really spoke about imagination. Very, very little mention of image work in eco-psychology. So what I've done in Waking Dreams is a kind of mashup between image-based work and eco-psychology and other things. So yeah, let's set it free, set the imagination free.
Sounds good. And I'm very interested and motivated by seeing the mind as plural, you know, whether you want to use the language of parts. Parts is very in vogue now with IFS and Richard Schwartz and ways of looking at multiplicity. Also subpersonalities, which I know you have an issue with the term, so we'll get onto that. So I guess an interesting thing could be to explore when we're dreaming. It takes this idea of what is actually manifesting in the dream, because on one level, a reductionist, rational, sort of almost Freudian view could be its brain function, and there's a reset taking place, whereas others might see different parts or aspects of self manifesting and getting into the idea of self, you know, spirit and soul. So that will sort of take us into this area of therapeutic change and how you see the self. And this is probably where we could introduce Jung and Assagioli.
Where to start on that? There's a lot there. I think, yeah, I mean, I have quite a big critique of reductionism in the book. I mean, I think a lot of how imagination is approached generally is what I call a mechanical imagination. So it's the root metaphor is the mind as a machine. And I write in the book about Freud's psychodynamics and how it was influenced by the technology of the day, the zeitgeist of the the late 1800s, early 1900s, thermodynamic technology, steam engines. So Freud's brilliant for metaphor. I mean, he combines clinical experiences with a rich tapestry of metaphor. And one of his main explanatory metaphors is the steam engine, basically. So, you know, how do you can't see the psyche, you can't weigh the psyche, you can't measure it. So you have to create metaphors to describe it, to talk about it. So he pictured the psyche as it were a steam engine, a vessel, the unconscious, full of energy, not of water molecules, but of feelings and thoughts and memories trapped in the unconscious, exerting forces against each other. So different parts, pistons, drive shafts, resistances, etc., etc. And he conceived of the therapeutic method as like a release valve where we allow this pent-up unconscious material to come into consciousness. And, you know, that survives, and psychodynamic theories, as you know, are still very much used because they have an explanatory power. They do reveal something. However, they also conceal things as well. Metaphors are only partial. The mind and certainly the imagination isn't entirely like a machine, because if it was, you could just turn on a switch and, you know, you wouldn't be depressed anymore.
Plus, dream interpretation would be you could replicate
guaranteed
the
every
analysis.
time. Yeah. So there's obviously more to it than a mechanical paradigm. So I present what I call an ecological imagination, which is drawing on metaphors from contemporary science, from complexity theory, which is how modern physics understands change. And they've modeled those theories not on the mechanical world, but on weather patterns, on human heartbeats, and on tidal rhythms. And this is a very different conception of the imagination and dream. which sees it not as a machine full of complicated parts that we can model with a boundary around it outside that we can sort of tinker with it. And because often like a mechanical imagination would isolate the key image, put it on the workbench of therapy, and try to affect some change in that inner child image, for example, help it grow up, become mature. But you can't, I mean, Winnicott, he spoke to this. He says there's no such thing as a baby, which for a child therapist is a kind of strange thing to say. But what he meant was, you can't understand a child, a baby, separate from the mother, separate from the environment, the house, the food, the culture within which it's reared. It's a complex system, a baby. And as with babies, so too with trees and waves and human imagination. It's a bringing together or a synthesis of lots and lots of different images, but also feelings, thoughts, sensations, actions, etc., etc. So for me, I'm trying to approach the image in its wholeness, not take it apart into its separate sub-personalities or part images. Treat it as a whole. Experientially, that's incredibly important. Of course, if you're not doing experiential work, knock yourself out and talk about parts and sub-personalities and the inner child. These are, for me, these are abstract terms that become terribly useful if we want to think about our lives, if we want to think about dream and imagination. But if we want to be imaginative, we need to avoid that kind of language because it creates distance. And like I said earlier, it turns the child character encounter into an inner child. What else? There's something else in your question about, you know, it's just kind of brain chemistry and resetting. See, resetting is another mechanical metaphor. So we think about ourselves as machines. I need a reboot. I'm feeling, I've crashed today. I've gone blank. It's difficult not to use mechanical metaphors because we're surrounded by machines. But we're not machines. But
we know we owe a lot, don't we, to Freud? I mean, if you take, he probably could be seen as the forerunner to neuroscience. He placed the dream into the brain, whereas before, dreams were from the gods, right?
Absolutely, we owe a lot to Freud, and that, you know, that doesn't mean we can't go beyond Freud or look at the limitations that he might bring. I mean, I don't know if I'd go down the sort of it's in your brain route. See, for me, because then that's saying that it's a subjective thing, and then you go back to the inner imagination paradigm. So for me, the really important thing that blew me away reading David Abraham, he's got a great book called Spell of the Sensuous. And he put this much more clearly than I'd read before. Imagination is an act of perception, so, which is happening right now. So as you're perhaps watching this YouTube video, you're looking at a screen, and the screen is a two-dimensional, flat, static, inert object. It's just a bunch of pixels. But hopefully you're not just perceiving a bunch of pixels. And it's imagination that takes that raw data, colored lights and some sounds, and you perceive a place. Images are three-dimensional places. You have perspective, movement, it's not static, and it personifies. It's inherently personifying. Images are alive. And you perceive me as a person, not an inert screen. So that's just with the screen, but it's actually happening all the time. So And this is where the wider relevance of imagination comes in when we release it from that inner paradigm. Because while it might not matter how we individually perceive a painting or a movie, how we imagine, how we perceive other people, our friends, family, colleagues, clients, how we perceive the world and our sense of belonging really does matter. And images arise between self and world. So yes, the brain obviously brings a lot to the table, and it's a complex system itself. But I would see images as not residing in the brain, but as residing in a liminal space in between self and other, which is what Donald Winnicott called it, a third field. Schwartz-Salient talks about the intermediary space. So there's different ways of thinking and talking about it. But I think for me, it's really important to articulate that middle ground. Because for me, that's psychological life. It happens. It's the story that appears between me and the world. And an image-centric therapy sees psychological suffering as what happens when that story moves towards a more repetitive or habitual, what we call fantasy imagining, that is poorly aligned to the evidence from the senses. So if you continue to perceive people as grumpy, as critical, as accusatory, despite them trying to be nice to you and empathize with you, you're really imagining the world. You've got stuck in a story about how things are, and you continue to see that habitually. And the journey is to allow in what I call novel images. So this is when there's a crack appears in the story fabric of the world. So in any therapy session, if we just sort of ground it in a particular therapeutic hour, I'll be sitting back, listening to the narrative, the story that the client tells me about whatever it is. And I'll be looking out for a novel image. So that might just be a strange pause, or when they frown, or maybe they might just change, make a gesture or move position, or they might just drop in a metaphor or say a word with an inflection or an emphasis that makes it stand out from the rest of their narrative. And usually, if you can spot them, they're like little portals that if you can just reflect them back. I mean, I don't pounce on them and say, oh, you've just told me a novel image. What does that mean? You know, the craft is to very gently, you don't want to chase it away, but to very gently, and I think this is what therapists are taught to do, is to land that strangeness, welcome it in, and hopefully experientially, for a while anyway, give it some room to grow. And that allows the client to begin to see or perceive slightly differently, and they move the story of the world and also themselves in that world along a little bit. They create, what we're looking to do is create a more malleable imagination that's able to respond to changing conditions as they arise. Which is basically why people come to therapy, because something big's changed, either in them or the world, a crisis within or without, and they can't handle it. They can't face it, whether that's a bereavement or a loss of a job, or an anxiety about climate change. Is too much to bear. So I understand all presenting issues as novel images that have led to a sense of overwhelm, and the old sense of self wants to go back into the security of the fantasy life, but that fantasy life's broken now. It doesn't quite work because you can't deny what's happened. So helping people to step into that wider seeing and being and doing and perceiving is the journey that I take them on. So yeah, it's not just in your brain. It's happening all the time.
I could talk for hours about this, Alan. But I guess we need to try and keep it as succinct as possible, this part. So is there anything about the book that we haven't spoken about that you want to mention?
Thanks. I've made a lot of effort in the book to keep it jargon free. It's arisen out of my background as a therapist, but it's not just for therapists. Obviously, it will be of interest for therapists, but it's written with a non-therapeutic reader firmly in mind. And it's a practical guidebook, if you like. So there's lots of exercises, lots of examples. And we particularly use the structure of waking dreams to explore the principles and the practices of imaginative life. However, this chapter structure, maybe I'll just finish on that, is a theoretical chapter. So the first chapter is embodied imagination, and we explore that as an idea with examples. And then there's an experiential chapter on waking dreams and how to ground and practice embodied imagination. And then we have another theoretical chapter. So I'm really happy with the way the chapter structure takes you on a journey through the basics to begin with. And then we get into richer, more novel material towards the end of the book.
Yeah, and as I say, it's very, very well written. I guess, finally, Alan, one of the risks that you pose is that imagining can be eclipsed by thinking and feeling. I think I know the answer, but what would you suggest is the best way to avoid that trap?
So if you think of imagining as a synthesis of sensation, so that's why we start with embodied imagination, because it's a lot to do with how, so whether you're in an eyes closed waking dream or looking at the world, you are attending to the surrounding environment. And what takes us away from noticing that surrounding environment, i.e. the imagescape, will be when feelings or thoughts spike. So we want to kind of balance out and not forget about the sensory experience. So if I'm doing a waking dream and someone gets a bit overwhelmed, I will vary. How far away are you from the tree? How high is the tree? What do you hear? What's the temperature of the breeze? So I move to helping them to describe the image environment. And then that comes alongside and helps them to contain and process the difficult feeling. I think that's what I would do. So like describe is one of my little maxims that I'm always giving my students. They're really keen to go into thinking about or asking what they feel, and it's very easy to miss out on just telling the story. Where are you? What's that place like? Who are you with, etc., etc.
Yeah, excellent answer. Alan, it's been a real pleasure. The book is available in all good bookstores and online, right?
Yeah, it's up there on Amazon now, and you can buy it from the publisher via my website on wildimagination.uk. Plug. But yeah, nice to talk to you, Noel. Thanks for the space to do that.
You're very welcome, and I hope good luck with the book, and it'll be a really very useful addition to the field of imagination and psychotherapy.
Cool. Thanks, Noel.